This is SBS News in Easy English. I'm Peggy Giacomellos. Anthony Albanese has not ruled out a formal apology to French President Emmanuel Macron over the submarine contract deal that was cancelled at short notice by the previous government. The Prime Minister will have a one-on-one meeting with Mr Macron in Paris, where he will seek to repair the relationship damaged in the wake of the contract cancelled. Mr Albanese says their private conversations will not be made public.
What I want to do, though, is to make sure that we can look forward in a way that builds the relationship to what it should be. It should be a relationship in which we can rely upon each other as we have for a long period of time, and in which we can trust each other and mutually benefit from building that relationship.
COVID-related payments have ended as a new financial year begins. Federal Health Minister Mark Butler says anyone who is infected with the coronavirus must still follow directions to isolate at home for a week. But pandemic leave payments will no longer be paid. Mr Butler says the federal government does not have a budget to continue funding what were intended as emergency payments. At least 14 people have been killed and more than 30 others are missing after a massive mudslide in northeast India. Disaster response workers and locals are trying to rescue those who remain buried under the debris. The mudslide is thought to have been caused by rain following weeks of heavy downpours across India and the neighbouring nation of Bangladesh. Around 200 people have been killed in downpours and mudslides in India's northeast and in Pakistan in recent weeks. At least 30 people are still missing and one person has died after the small boat they were in sank off the coast of Libya. Doctors Without Borders says a rescue ship managed to rescue around 70 people, including some women and children, but a pregnant woman later died and others remain unaccounted for. The New South Wales government says it's no closer to ending a dispute over the state's new Korean-built train fleet with the state's rail union. The union is continuing strike action today, making only 30% of Sydney's trains available after talks with transport authorities broke down on Thursday. A draft government proposal to make more than $260 million worth of safety changes has done little to get the trains back on tracks. The union says it wants a formal deal in writing. Rail, Tram and Bus Union State Secretary Alex Classens says the RTBU has been pushing for action for a long time.
We had a promise from a previous Transport Minister before the last state election, before the last enterprise agreement. We've had promise after promise, backflip after backflip, reneging after reneging. And yet again, the goalposts have moved. We've got a government that sits there, a government minister that sits there and makes a promise, and then 5 minutes later, somebody else is changing the ground rules. So there's a tug-of-war going on inside government. We're not sure who's coming out on top, but it would appear to be that it's not David Elliott.
Queensland's police force are changing their age requirements for new recruits. The minimum application age has been lowered from 18 to 17 in a bid to get more people to sign up to the service. Police Commissioner Katarina Carroll has told Channel 7 the change has been made so that teenage school leavers can apply early and be ready to start work once they turn 18.
It will be the case that we want them here at 18, they will be out on the road at 18 and a half. What I want to do today is to encourage every 17-year-old in Queensland to apply for the Queensland Police Service.
And that's SBS News in Easy English.
Welcome to SBS News in Easy English. I'm Gareth Borum. Thousands of people in New South Wales have been told to evacuate or get ready to leave their homes as heavy rain continues to cause flooding across large parts of the state. The State Emergency Service responded to hundreds of requests for help overnight and performed more than 100 flood rescues across the Illawarra, Blue Mountains, Sydney Metropolitan, Hunter and Central Coast districts. Premier Dominic Perrottet has urged the public to follow safety instructions.
Please, we say this every flood event, please don't drive through floodwaters. Once again, we don't say that for the sake of it. We say that to keep you safe. And after every flood event, we have a number of flood rescues and sometimes deaths that take place because people don't follow that instruction and they drive through floodwaters. And people drive through floodwaters because they can't see the depth of the road beneath. That you cannot appreciate how deep that water is.
A rescue attempt is also being organised for the crew aboard a bulk cargo ship that has lost power off the coast south of Sydney. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has announced more sanctions on Russia and more military aid for Ukraine after visiting the war-torn country. After touring destroyed towns near Kyiv with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, Mr Albanese pledged almost $100 million in further military assistance. This includes 14 armoured personnel carriers and 20 Bushmaster protected mobility vehicles. There will also be another $8.7 million to help upgrade border management equipment and cyber security measures. Mr Albanese says it brings Australia's total military assistance to Ukraine to more than $380 million.
In Bushehr today, I saw clear evidence of a war crime. People need to be held to account for their actions. Australia stands ready to continue to support the government and the people of Ukraine for as long as it takes for Ukraine to emerge victorious in defence of your national sovereignty and your homeland. Because you are fighting for the international rule of law.
Australia's first Truth-Telling Commission has requested a 2-year extension to deliver its final report, as it moves to focus on modern injustices against Indigenous people. To mark NAIDOC Week, Victoria's Yuruk Justice Commission has released its interim report after meeting with 174 local elders across the state and another 7 in Melbourne-based public hearings. While too soon to make findings and recommendations, the inquiry has asked Victorian Governor Linda Dessau to extend the due date for its final report from mid-2024 to mid-2026 and sign off on additional resources. The French ambassador to Australia says a free trade agreement between Australia and the European Union is now on the cards, thanks to the federal government's commitment to tackle climate change. While such a deal is unlikely to be signed before 2023, the new Australian government's approach has been welcomed by members of the EU. French Ambassador Jean-Pierre Thébault describes the relationship under Prime Minister Anthony Albanese as a complete new arena of cooperation between France and Australia. He welcomed Australia's pledge to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 43% on 2005 levels by 2030. To sport, and in tennis, one of Wimbledon's greatest champions has marked the 100th anniversary of centre court by qualifying for another quarter-final. Making the last 8 for the 13th time in his career, the 6-time title holder Novak Djokovic will meet one of the game's rising stars, 20-year-old Italian Yannick Sinner.
Very tough. I mean, I've never faced him before, and he's kind of a new face on the tour, and he has won his first ATP match, actually on the tournament that he has won a few weeks ago in his country, beating players that are from top 5, top 10 in the world. So he was on the streak on this surface, and I knew that, it wasn't going to be easy,
I'm Gareth Boreham, This is SBS News in Easy English.
Welcome to SBS News in Easy English. I'm Greg Dyatt. Thousands of homes have been left without electricity in New South Wales because of the latest flooding. Some locations have received up to 800 millimetres of rain in 4 days. Emergency Management Minister Steph Cook says the rain will soon ease, but the emergency is far from over.
We're not quite through it yet. We've got major flooding heights still on a number of river systems.
A cargo ship that lost power off the New South Wales coast in heavy seas is now anchored south of Port Botany after a long rescue operation involving 3 tugboats. The state's Port Authority says the captain and crew of the Portland Bay had been through a very challenging 24 hours, but the situation is under control. The Reserve Bank is expected to increase interest rates today. There are predictions the rate will rise to 1.35%. The New South Wales government says people need to get their COVID-19 booster vaccination. Only 68% of the population has had 3 doses. Health Minister Brad Hazzard says 3 doses are needed to provide proper protection.
Ask your mates, have you had the full dose? Because if you do, you're going to be a lot safer. You're going to have far less likelihood of getting really ill and far less likelihood of dying.
Some of Australia's states and territories are considering reintroducing the requirement to wear a mask because of rising COVID-19 case numbers. 6 people have been killed in another mass shooting in the United States. A gunman used a high-powered rifle to shoot people taking part in an American Independence Day parade in Chicago. At least 24 people are injured. Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker says he's angry.
I'm furious. I'm furious that yet more innocent lives were taken by gun violence. I'm furious that their loved ones are forever broken by what took place today.
Protests have erupted in the United States following the release of police body cam footage showing the police shooting an unarmed African-American man more than 60 times. 25-year-old Jayland Walker was killed in a hail of gunfire in Akron, Ohio, when police chased him after a traffic stop. Spanish police say they have seized 3 underwater drones built to smuggle drugs across the sea from Morocco. The unmanned drones are apparently capable of carrying up to 200 kilograms of cargo. 8 people have been arrested. A new World Vision report says a mental health crisis looms for Ukrainian children because of the devastating long-term impacts of the war. Data shows the Ukraine war is scarring the mental health of a generation of children, with up to 1.5 million children facing anxiety and depression. I'm Greg Dyatt, and that's SBS News in Easy English. Welcome to SBS News in Easy English. I'm Greg Dyatt. New South Wales Premier Dominic Perrottet says the state's flood emergency is far from over. It's the fourth major flood event for residents of the Hawkesbury region north of Sydney. Flood disaster recovery payments will be available from tomorrow. They will include $1,000 for every eligible adult and $400 for every child across the 23 local government areas impacted so far. Mr. Perrottet says it's been a difficult couple of years.
For many of the areas, particularly that we're seeing in the Hawkesbury Nepean, also in southwest, but obviously particularly in the Hawkesbury Nepean area, there's been flood event after flood event. Many people are tired.
A Hong Kong cargo ship stranded in waters off Sydney will be towed into Port Botany by the end of the day, following an order by the Maritime Authority. The 170-metre ship and its 21 crew members have been floating off the coast just south of the city since the ship's engines failed. Australia is expected to follow other parts of the world in expanding eligibility for a fourth COVID-19 vaccine dose to the wider population. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese says the immunisation experts will look at available evidence before making a recommendation. The Australian Technical Advisory Group on Immunisation is expected to discuss the benefits of expanding the fourth dose eligibility at their meeting today. Victoria has extended its pandemic declaration by 3 months. Health experts are also considering whether to reintroduce mask mandates or introduce a second booster to curb COVID-19 cases. Premier Daniel Andrews says he is satisfied COVID-19 continues to pose a serious risk to public health throughout the state. New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern will fly out of Sydney after a visit to strengthen trade, tourism and security ties. Following 2 days of meetings and speaking arrangements in Melbourne, Ms Ardern is scheduled to appear at several tourism and business events in Sydney. She says her 5-day trip across the Tasman is a way to reconnect New Zealand after largely closing itself off to the world during the COVID-19 pandemic. The suspected shooter at an Independence Day parade near the US city of Chicago has been charged with 7 counts of murder. 21-year-old Robert E. Cremo is accused of firing over 70 rounds from a roof into a crowd of people during 4th of July celebrations, killing 7 people and injuring dozens of others. Illinois' state attorney, Eric Reinhardt, says the suspect faces more charges in coming days.
These are just the first of many charges that will be filed against Mr. Cremo. I want to emphasize that. There will be more charges.
Nick Kyrgios will appear in court next month, accused of assaulting a former girlfriend last December. 27-year-old Kyrgios will appear in the ACT Magistrates Court on the 2nd of August, facing one charge of common assault. I'm Greg Dyett, and that's SBS News in Easy English.
Welcome to SBS News in Easy English. I'm Philippa Carisbrook. More people are to become eligible for a fourth dose of a COVID-19 vaccine. Australia's leading immunisation body has updated its vaccination advice, recommending people over 50 receive a second booster shot. They'll be eligible from Monday. People aged between 30 and 49 years old will also be able to have a fourth dose if they choose to. The time between vaccine doses will also be reduced from 4 months to 3 months. The decision by the Australian Technical Advisory Group on Immunisation comes amid rising numbers of virus cases. Foreign Minister Penny Wong says she's open to meeting her Chinese counterpart on the sidelines of the G20 summit. The event is about to start in Indonesia. Ms. Wong says China has to be willing to repair relations with Australia.
We believe it would be in China and Australia's interests for this relationship to be stabilised.
An Australian foreign minister hasn't met a Chinese foreign minister since 2019. The nation's defence ministers recently met in Singapore, the highest level ministerial contact between the nations in 3 years. New Zealand's Prime Minister says Australia and New Zealand must remember the sovereignty and independence of Pacific nations when they choose to engage with other countries. Jacinda Ardern is visiting Australia ahead of next week's Pacific Islands Forum. China's growing influence in the region is expected to be discussed at the event. Ms. Ardern says nations in the Indo-Pacific should set their own priorities free from force or persuasion. Recovery efforts are beginning in some flood-affected communities in New South Wales. Rain has eased in Sydney and the Central Coast, but authorities say the threat of flooding remains for tens of thousands of people in areas including the Hunter Valley and the mid-North Coast. 50 flood rescues were carried out overnight. New South Wales Minister for Emergency Services, Steph Cook, says people should take care when they return home. Britain's Prime Minister is facing growing calls to resign. More than 40 people have quit their government positions, saying they've lost faith in the Conservative Party led by Boris Johnson. His government has been beset by a series of scandals. Recently, he apologised after appointing a politician to a role involving pastoral care, not recalling the minister had been the subject of sexual misconduct complaints. Australia has recorded a record trade surplus of nearly $16 billion. A rise in exports of coal and other mineral fuels contributed to the surplus in May. Imports rose by $2.3 billion, led by fuels and lubricants. Meanwhile, new job advertisements have declined for the first time since December. Despite the 2.1% fall in June, job ads are still almost 72% above pre-pandemic levels. Over 400 prisoners are missing in Nigeria, following a raid on a prison. Authorities say 4 inmates, a security guard, and several attackers were killed in the attack on a prison in the capital, Abuja. Islamic State has claimed responsibility. In sport, the Hockeyroos have made it through to the FIH World Cup quarter-finals. The Australian women's team beat South Africa 2-1 in Spain. It was two-time Olympian Mariah Williams' 100th game. The Wiradjuri woman says she's proud to achieve the milestone during NAIDOC week. In tennis, Nick Kyrgios has reached the semi-final at Wimbledon for the first time in his career. The Australian defeated Chile's Christian Garin in the quarter-finals. The 27-year-old faces Rafael Nadal next. I'm Philippa Carisbrook. This is SBS News in Easy English. Welcome to SBS News in Easy English. I'm Philippa Carisbrook. Former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has reportedly been taken to hospital after being shot while delivering a speech. Local media reports gunshots were heard at the scene in the city of Nara before Mr. Abe collapsed bleeding. Kyodo News reports he was unconscious and unresponsive. Local station MBS says he was in cardiac arrest. A male suspect has been detained at the scene. New Zealanders living in Australia could be given voting rights and more ways to permanent residency. The matter's been discussed by Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and New Zealand's leader Jacinda Ardern. Mr. Albanese says the countries need to work towards more seamless transitions for citizens.
We don't want people to be temporary residents forever, and what we'll do is we'll work on ways of a pathway to citizenship.
The leaders also discussed China's presence in the Pacific region. Ms. Ardern says Pacific nations shouldn't be forced to pick a side between China and the West.
It should be the Pacific priorities first and foremost. They should be free of coercion.
Britain's Prime Minister Boris Johnson has resigned. A race to replace him has begun. Mr. Johnson says he will stay on until a successor is found. It's unclear how long that will take.
I want you to know how sad I am to be giving up the best job in the world. But them's the breaks. Thank you all very much.
Prime Minister Anthony Albanese says his government will work with whoever is chosen to replace Mr. Johnson. He says the relationship between Australia and Britain will remain strong. Flooding in parts of the Hunter region in New South Wales is reaching record levels. There are over 60 evacuation orders in place. Almost 40,000 people are affected. Residents are returning home in some areas. They're being told to be cautious as they clean up. Disaster payments have been extended to 6 more local government areas. To the United States, and the former police officer convicted of murdering black man George Floyd has been sentenced for another crime. Derek Chauvin is serving a 22-year jail sentence for killing Mr. Floyd during an arrest. The 46-year-old has now been sentenced to over 20 years in prison for civil rights violations. The sentences will run at the same time. The Australian government's introduced a new code of conduct for ministers and their staff. The code will require ministers to sell any shares they own directly. Ministers will be able to have shares in superannuation and other managed funds. They will not be allowed to have a blind trust arrangement where funds come from unknown sources. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese says he wants Australians to have confidence in the people they elect. Victoria Police are introducing a new reporting tool. It aims to reduce street harassment. The text-based service, called Stop It, allows people to report their experiences. Plan International Australia says around 80% of women have experienced street harassment. The Women's Equality Organisation says it's one of the biggest dangers facing young women. In sport, Nick Kyrgios has progressed to the final of Wimbledon. It follows the withdrawal of Rafael Nadal from their upcoming semi-final due to injury. The Spaniard has a painful abdominal injury. Kyrgios has wished the player a swift recovery. I'm Philippa Carisbrook. This is SBS News in Easy English.